The silhouette of Jacob Blackwood struck fear into the hearts of the townsfolk of Redemption Creek. Standing nearly 6.5 feet tall, with shoulders as broad as a doorframe, his scarred face half hidden beneath a wide-brimmed hat, he cut an imposing figure against the backdrop of the Montana Territory's rugged mountains. The year was 1878, and the West was still wild enough that a man's reputation often preceded him. And Blackwood's reputation was that of a killer, a man whose hands had taken more lives than anyone dared count. As he dismounted from his massive black stallion outside the town's only hotel, women hurried their children indoors, and men reached instinctively for their sidearms. The whispers followed him like shadows. "That's him, the Butcher of Bannock. They say he killed 20 men in the mining wars. Devil's got no soul behind those eyes." Blackwood heard them, as he always did, but his face remained impassive, weathered by 45 years of hardship and the unforgiving western sun. If you're enjoying this story, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your impressions in the comments. Which city are you watching from? What none of them knew was that Jacob Blackwood had come to Redemption Creek not to bring death, but to escape it. 3 months ago, he'd buried his last victim, or so he hoped, and with trembling hands had placed his notorious Colt revolver in a lockbox, swearing a solemn oath to never again take a human life. For 20 years, he'd been a gun for hire, an enforcer for mining companies and cattle barons, a man who solved problems with lead and gunpowder when money and threats failed. The blood on his hands had long since dried, but it remained, invisible to all but him, a stain he feared would never wash away. He had purchased a small ranch 10 miles outside of town, hoping to live out his remaining years in solitude, raising horses and finding whatever peace might be available to a man with his history. Sheriff Thomas Garrett watched Blackwood's arrival from the window of his office, his weathered face creased with concern. At 52, Garrett had seen his share of hard men come through Redemption Creek, but none with Blackwood's reputation. The stories of his brutality during the range wars in Wyoming had spread throughout the territories like wildfire. They said he'd once shot a man 17 times, reloading his revolver twice just to make a point. They said he'd killed a U.S. Marshal in Colorado and never stood trial. They said a lot of things about Jacob Blackwood, and though Garrett didn't believe half of them, he knew enough to be wary. The sheriff's hand unconsciously moved to touch the worn oak handle of his Colt Peacemaker as he watched the giant man secure his horse and enter the hotel. Inside the Prairie Rose Hotel, the conversations died as Blackwood ducked his head to enter through the doorway. The afternoon sun cast his enormous shadow across the worn floorboards as he approached the front desk. Herbert Simmons, the hotel's owner, visibly trembled as the massive man removed his hat, revealing a face that seemed carved from stone. A jagged scar ran from his left eye to the corner of his mouth, and his steel-gray eyes held the cold emptiness of a man who had seen too much of death. "Room for a week," Blackwood said, his voice surprisingly soft and articulate for a man of his imposing stature. Simmons nodded frantically, nearly dropping the room key as he handed it over. Blackwood placed $3 silver on the counter, more than the room was worth, and turned toward the stairs without waiting for change. The town of Redemption Creek had grown substantially in the past 5 years, transforming from a simple mining camp to a proper settlement with a school, a church, and businesses that catered to the needs of the 300 souls who called it home. What had drawn Blackwood to this particular town wasn't its amenities, but its isolation, and the fact that it sat in a fertile valley, surrounded by excellent grazing land, perfect for the horse ranch he intended to establish. He had wired ahead to purchase the old McAllister property, a transaction handled by the town's attorney, William Hayes, who had been all too happy to conclude the deal without meeting the buyer in person. Blackwood planned to visit Hayes first thing in the morning to finalize the paperwork, and then he would begin his new life. Sleep did not come easily to Jacob Blackwood that night. As he lay on the surprisingly comfortable bed in his hotel room, memories of the faces of men he had killed paraded through his mind, as they did most nights. The most persistent face belonged to his last victim, a young cowhand who had drawn on him in a saloon in Cheyenne after recognizing him as the man who had killed his older brother years before. The boy couldn't have been more than 19, and his hand had shaken so badly as he'd pulled his pistol that he'd never had a chance. Blackwood had put a bullet through his heart before the boy's gun had even cleared its holster. It was that boy's dying eyes, filled not with hate, but with terrible disappointment, that had finally broken something in Blackwood's soul. He had walked out of that saloon, ridden for 3 days straight, and then thrown up everything in his stomach when he finally stopped. Morning brought no respite from the whispers that followed Blackwood down Redemption Creek's main street. Mothers pulled their children close as he passed, and men stood a little straighter, a little more defiantly, as if to prove they weren't afraid, though the sweat on their brows betrayed them. He ignored them all as he made his way to the office of William Hayes, attorney at law. The lawyer's reaction upon seeing Blackwood in the flesh was predictable. First shock, then fear, finally a nervous professional courtesy that barely masked his discomfort. The paperwork was prepared, requiring only Blackwood's signature and the remainder of the payment. As he signed his name in a surprisingly elegant hand, Hayes couldn't help but ask the question that had been burning in his mind. "Mr. Blackwood, if I may be so bold, what brings a man of your reputation to our little town?" "Horses," Blackwood replied simply, his voice low and measured. "I aim to breed and train them. Good stock." Hayes nodded, though his expression made it clear he found this answer difficult to believe. The transaction complete, Blackwood tipped his hat and exited the office, aware of the lawyer's relieved exhalation behind him. His next stop would be the general store to purchase supplies for his new property. As he crossed the street, the stagecoach rumbled into town, kicking up dust that momentarily obscured the view. When it cleared, Blackwood found himself face to face with a small woman in a plain blue dress, her arms laden with books. She couldn't have been more than 30, with chestnut hair pulled back in a practical bun, and intelligent eyes that widened as she took in his towering form. Her name was Sarah Prescott, and she had arrived in Redemption Creek 6 months earlier to take over as the town's school teacher, after the previous one had departed to get married. Educated back east at a women's college in Boston, she had come west seeking adventure and purpose, finding both in the eager minds of Redemption Creek's children. Unlike the other townspeople, Sarah's initial reaction to Blackwood was not fear, but curiosity. She had heard the whispers about the notorious gunman who had purchased the old McAllister place. But standing before him now, what struck her most was not his fearsome appearance, but the profound sadness that seemed to emanate from him. "Excuse me," she said, her voice clear and unafraid as she adjusted her burden of books. "Would you mind terribly helping me with these? The stagecoach driver was in rather a hurry." Blackwood stared at her for a long moment, genuinely surprised by the request. No one had asked him for help in years. They asked him to kill, to threaten, to intimidate, but never for something as simple and decent as carrying books. Without a word, he extended his massive hands, and Sarah placed the stack of books in them as if it were the most natural thing in the world. "I'm heading to the schoolhouse," she explained, gesturing toward a small white building at the edge of town. "I'm Sarah Prescott, the teacher here." Blackwood nodded, but offered no introduction in return, falling into step beside her as they walked. The sight of the fearsome gunslinger, carrying a schoolteacher's books, drew stares from everyone they passed, but Sarah seemed either oblivious to or unconcerned by the attention. The schoolhouse was a simple structure, with a small bell tower and fresh white paint that gleamed in the morning sun. As they approached, the sound of children's laughter spilled from the open windows. Blackwood hesitated at the bottom of the steps, suddenly reluctant to proceed. "You can set them on my desk," Sarah said, misinterpreting his pause as uncertainty about where to place the books. She led the way inside, where a dozen children of various ages abruptly fell silent at the sight of the giant man in the doorway. Their young faces registered fear as they recognized the monster their parents had warned them about. Blackwood felt their stares like physical blows and quickly deposited the books on the teacher's desk. "Thank you, Mr. Sarah prompted, looking up at him expectantly. "Blackwood," he replied quietly, acutely aware of the children's fearful gazes. "Jacob Blackwood." He turned to leave, eager to escape the suffocating silence his presence had created. But Sarah's voice stopped him. "Mr. Blackwood, we were just about to begin our history lesson on the Civil War. I understand you served?" The question caught him off guard. He hadn't spoken of his time as a Union cavalry soldier in nearly 15 years. He turned back slowly, nodding once, uncertain of her purpose. "Would you consider sharing some of your experiences with the class? First-hand accounts are invaluable for bringing history to life." The children looked horrified at the prospect, and Blackwood felt a familiar pain in his chest, the pain of being seen only as something to be feared. "Another time, perhaps," he muttered, and then he was gone, his spurs jingling softly as he descended the schoolhouse steps. For the next week, Blackwood focused on making his new property habitable. The previous owner had let the buildings fall into disrepair, and Blackwood threw himself into the physical labor of mending fences, repairing the roof of the small cabin, and clearing out the stables. The work was therapeutic, allowing him to exhaust his body to the point where sleep came more easily, with fewer nightmares. He ventured into town only when necessary for supplies, enduring the fearful looks and hushed conversations with stoic resignation. This was to be his life now, solitude broken only by inevitable interactions with people who would never see beyond his reputation. On his third trip to town, he purchased 4 mares and a stallion from a horse trader passing through, the beginning of the breeding stock for his planned enterprise. It was 2 weeks after his arrival that Sheriff Garrett finally paid him a visit. Blackwood was splitting wood behind his cabin when he heard the approach of a horse. His hand instinctively moved toward his hip before he remembered that he no longer wore his gun. It remained locked away in the wooden box under his bed. Garrett appeared around the corner of the cabin, his badge gleaming in the afternoon sun. "Blackwood," he acknowledged with a nod, dismounting and tying his horse to a hitching post. "Sheriff," Blackwood returned. Embedding the axe in the chopping block and wiping his hands on his trousers, the 2 men sized each other up, recognizing in each other the wary respect of those who had survived long enough in a dangerous profession to acquire wisdom along with their scars. "Town's been talking about nothing but you since you arrived," Garrett said, removing his hat and wiping sweat from his brow. "Thought I should come see for myself what Jacob Blackwood plans to do in my jurisdiction." There was no accusation in his tone, merely professional interest, and perhaps a hint of concern. Blackwood gestured toward the cabin's small porch, where a pitcher of water and 2 tin cups sat on a rough-hewn table. The men settled themselves, and Blackwood poured water for both of them before responding. "I'm here to raise horses, Sheriff, nothing more." Garrett studied him over the rim of his cup, his eyes narrowed slightly. "Heard you've given up the gun." It wasn't a question, but Blackwood answered it anyway. Yes. The single word carried the weight of finality. "Any particular reason a man with your skills would make such a decision?" Garrett pressed, genuine curiosity evident in his voice. Blackwood's gaze drifted toward the distant mountains, their peaks still capped with snow despite the late spring warmth. "Killed a boy in Cheyenne," he said finally. "Too young to die, too young to be facing me. Had his brother's vengeance in his eyes, but couldn't steady his hand enough to even get a shot off." He fell silent, the memory playing out behind his eyes. Garrett waited, sensing there was more. "Been killing for 20 years, Sheriff. Started in the war and never really stopped. Became good at it. Too good. That boy in Cheyenne, he made me realize I didn't want to be good at killing anymore." The confession hung in the air between them, more words than Blackwood had spoken to anyone in months. Sheriff Garrett nodded slowly, seeming to accept Blackwood's sincerity. "Way I see it, a man's entitled to change his path if he's genuine about it." He drained his cup and set it down deliberately. "But I should warn you, there are those in town who aren't comfortable with your presence, regardless of your intentions. The Cattlemen's Association in particular. William Stanton leads them, and he's been making noise about you being bad for business." Blackwood's expression remained impassive, though inwardly he sighed. It was always the same, men like Stanton, wealthy and powerful, viewing anyone they couldn't control as a threat. "I'll keep to myself," he promised. "Won't cause any trouble." Garrett stood, settling his hat back on his head. "See that you don't," he said, though without malice. "And Blackwood? That teacher, Miss Prescott, she's been asking about you. Seems to think there's more to you than the stories." The mention of Sarah Prescott unsettled Blackwood in a way he couldn't quite define. In the weeks since their brief encounter, he had found himself thinking of her unexpectedly. The lack of fear in her eyes when she looked at him, the natural way she had handed him her books, as if he were any other man and not a notorious killer. He had avoided the schoolhouse and any part of town where he might encounter her again, telling himself it was better that way. Better for her not to be seen associating with someone like him. But Garrett's words stirred something in him, a forgotten longing for human connection that he had buried beneath years of isolation and violence. "Good day, Sheriff," was all he said in response, and Garrett, understanding that the conversation was over, mounted his horse and rode away, leaving Blackwood alone with thoughts he'd rather not examine too closely. The following Saturday brought an unexpected visitor to Blackwood's ranch. He was in the corral, working with one of the mares, when the sound of an approaching buggy caught his attention. The horse was a sturdy bay, pulling a modest 2-wheeled rig, and the driver was Sarah Prescott. She wore a simple dress of pale yellow, her hair loose around her shoulders instead of in its usual practical bun, and a determined expression on her face. Blackwood felt a moment of panic, an urge to retreat to the cabin and avoid this confrontation. But the mare nudged his shoulder as if sensing his discomfort, and he stayed put. Sarah brought the buggy to a halt and secured the reins before climbing down unaided. She approached the corral fence with a confidence that belied her small stature. "Mr. Blackwood," she called out in greeting, her smile genuine as she reached the fence. "I hope you don't mind the intrusion. I've brought something for you." She held up a book, bound in worn leather, its title obscured by her hand. Blackwood approached cautiously, keeping the mare between himself and the fence, as if the animal might shield him from whatever complication this woman represented. "Miss Prescott," he acknowledged, his voice rougher than he intended. "What brings you all the way out here?" Sarah extended the book toward him, and after a moment's hesitation, he took it, careful not to let their fingers brush. The title, he saw, was The Odyssey by Homer, a story he knew by reputation but had never read. "You mentioned you served in the Union cavalry," she explained. "This is a story about a warrior trying to find his way home after a terrible war. I thought you might enjoy it." The thoughtfulness of the gesture left him momentarily speechless. He stared down at the book in his massive hands, incongruously delicate against his callous skin. "I'm not much for reading," he said finally, though it wasn't entirely true. As a boy, before the war had taken him, he had devoured every book he could find. It was just one more part of himself he had left behind. Sarah's expression fell slightly, and he immediately regretted his words. "But I'll give it a try," he added quickly, rewarded by the return of her smile. There was an awkward silence as Blackwood struggled to understand why this educated woman had gone out of her way to bring him a book. Would you like some coffee?" he asked finally, the words feeling foreign in his mouth. When was the last time he had invited anyone to share his company? Sarah accepted his invitation with a nod, and Blackwood secured the mare in the corral before leading the way to his cabin. The interior was sparse but scrupulously clean, with a small wood stove, a table with 2 chairs, a narrow bed in the corner, and shelves holding the bare essentials of a solitary life. "It's not much," he said, suddenly self-conscious about the simplicity of his surroundings. Sarah surveyed the cabin with interest rather than judgment. "It's a good start," she said, and there was something in those words that resonated with him. The acknowledgement that he was beginning something new here, not merely hiding from his past. He busied himself preparing coffee, aware of her watching him, the silence between them surprisingly comfortable. When he placed a steaming cup before her, she thanked him with that same direct gaze that seemed to look past his fearsome exterior. "The children have been asking about you," Sarah said after taking a sip of her coffee. "They've heard all sorts of wild tales." Blackwood grimaced, imagining the nightmarish stories that must be circulating among Redemption Creek's youth. "No doubt they're terrified," he muttered, staring into his own cup. Sarah's response surprised him. "Actually, they're fascinated. Children have a way of seeing past the stories adults tell them. Johnny Miller, one of my 3rd-grade pupils, is convinced you must have fought in 100 duels and killed at least 50 outlaws." There was gentle amusement in her voice, but no mockery. "Perhaps someday you might visit our class and let them see for themselves that you're just a man, not the monster from their parents' warnings." The word monster hit Blackwood like a physical blow, though he knew Sarah hadn't meant it cruelly. "Is that what you see, Miss Prescott?" he asked quietly, meeting her eyes across the table. "A monster trying to play at being a man?" Sarah held his gaze without flinching. "I see a man carrying a very heavy burden," she replied, her voice soft but firm. "A man who has done things he regrets and is searching for redemption. Am I wrong?" The directness of her assessment left him feeling exposed, as if she had somehow peered into the darkest corners of his soul. No one had ever read him so accurately, and he found himself both unnerved and oddly comforted by her perception. "No," he admitted after a long silence. "You're not wrong." Their conversation shifted to safer topics. Sarah's journey from Boston to the Montana Territory, the challenges of teaching children of different ages and abilities in a one-room schoolhouse, Blackwood's plans for his horse breeding operation. As they talked, Blackwood felt something within him gradually uncoil, a tension he had carried for so long that he had forgotten what it felt like to be without it. When Sarah finally announced that she should be heading back to town before dark, he was surprised to find himself reluctant to see her go. He walked her to her buggy, feeling awkward and oversized beside her petite frame. "Thank you for the book," he said, holding it carefully in his hands, "and for the company." Sarah smiled up at him, and for the first time in years, Blackwood felt the faintest stirring of hope. In the days that followed, Blackwood found himself drawn into the world of the Odyssey, reading by lamplight late into the night. The story of Odysseus, the warrior trying to find his way home after years of bloodshed, resonated with him in ways he hadn't expected. He recognized in the ancient Greek hero his own struggle to reconcile the man he had been with the man he wished to become. The book became a bridge between his solitary present and the more connected life Sarah's visit had awakened a yearning for. When he finished reading, he knew he would need to return the book, and the prospect of seeing her again filled him with both anticipation and dread. What place could someone like him have in the life of a woman like Sarah Prescott? His decision to return the book coincided with an unexpected invitation. As he approached the general store on his weekly trip for supplies, he was intercepted by Tom Jenkins, one of the few townspeople who had treated him with anything resembling normalcy. Jenkins ran the livery stable and had sold Blackwood feed for his horses. "Town's having a social on Saturday," Jenkins informed him, leaning against a hitching post. "Raising funds for a new bell for the church. Miss Prescott suggested I extend an invitation to you, seeing as you're part of the community now." Blackwood's first instinct was to refuse, to retreat back to the safety of his isolation. But the thought that Sarah had specifically asked for him to be included gave them pause. "I'll think on it," he replied noncommittally, though in truth he had already decided to attend, if only to return her book and perhaps see that unguarded smile again. The social was held in the town square, with tables of food arranged under a canopy of lanterns strung between the trees. When Blackwood arrived, dressed in his cleanest shirt with his hair slicked back with water, the initial reaction was predictable. Conversations faltered. Parents drew their children closer. Men straightened and eyed him warily. But then Sarah Prescott was there, moving through the crowd to greet him, and the tension eased slightly at her obvious welcome. Mr. Blackwood, I'm so glad you decided to come," she said, her eyes bright with genuine pleasure. He awkwardly handed her the book, mumbling his thanks and a few stilted observations about the story. She listened attentively, as if his halting commentary was as valuable as a scholar's analysis, and then, to his astonishment, took his arm to lead him toward the food tables. "You must try Mrs. Abernathy's apple pie," she insisted. "It's quite famous in these parts." The evening progressed with a surreal quality for Blackwood. Most people gave him a wide berth, but Sarah remained by his side, drawing him into conversations, introducing him to those brave enough to approach. Among them was the town doctor, an elderly man named Frederick Wilson, who, to Blackwood's surprise, treated him with professional courtesy rather than fear. "Miss Prescott tells me you're breeding horses," Dr. Wilson said, his roomy eyes intelligent and assessing. "I've always been fond of good horseflesh myself. Perhaps I might visit your ranch sometime to see your stock?" Before Blackwood could respond, a commotion across the square drew their attention. William Stanton, the head of the Cattlemen's Association, was arguing loudly with Sheriff Garrett, his face flushed with anger and perhaps too much whiskey. "This is a respectable gathering," Stanton was saying, his voice carrying easily over the suddenly hushed crowd. "We shouldn't have to socialize with killers and degenerates." He pointed an accusing finger directly at Blackwood, his expression twisted with disgust. "That man has more blood on his hands than anyone in 3 territories. He doesn't belong here, among decent folk." Sheriff Garrett placed a restraining hand on Stanton's arm, speaking to him in low tones that didn't carry to where Blackwood stood, rigid with tension. He felt Sarah's small hand on his sleeve, anchoring him to the moment, preventing him from retreating as every instinct urged him to do. "Mr. Stanton is drunk and foolish," she said clearly, loudly enough for those nearby to hear, "and he knows nothing about redemption or second chances." The confrontation might have escalated further had Reverend Thomas not stepped forward, his clerical collar gleaming white in the lantern light. "William, that's enough," he said firmly. "We welcome all to our gathering, as we welcome all to our church. Judge not, lest ye be judged." Stanton spat on the ground, muttering something under his breath, but allowed himself to be led away by 2 of his ranch hands. The incident cast a pall over the social, however, and Blackwood knew his presence was making everyone uncomfortable. "I should go," he said quietly to Sarah, who looked distressed at the turn of events. She started to protest, but he shook his head. "It's better this way. Thank you for—" He gestured vaguely, unable to articulate what her kindness had meant to him. "I'll see you again." It was both a promise and a question. The confrontation at the social was only the beginning of William Stanton's campaign against Blackwood. Over the next few weeks, Blackwood found himself increasingly isolated as Stanton pressured local businesses to refuse him service. The general store owner apologetically explained that he could no longer extend credit. The blacksmith was suddenly too busy to shoe Blackwood's horses. Even Tom Jenkins at the livery was forced to limit his interactions, though he managed to warn Blackwood that Stanton was spreading rumors, claiming that Blackwood was planning to take over the valley through intimidation and violence, driving out honest ranchers to establish his own criminal empire. The allegations were absurd, but fear was a powerful motivator, and Stanton knew just how to manipulate it. Despite the growing hostility from the town, Sarah continued to visit Blackwood's ranch, bringing books, conversation, and news from Redemption Creek. Her carriage would appear once or twice a week, and those visits became the bright points around which Blackwood ordered his existence. She told him of her students' progress, shared gossip about town affairs, and gradually drew out his own stories, not just of the war and his life as a gunman, but of his childhood in Pennsylvania, his love of horses that had begun when he was just a boy, the dreams he had abandoned and was now tentatively reclaiming. In her presence, he found himself able to speak of things he had never shared with another soul, as if her gentle acceptance created a space where even the darkest parts of himself could be acknowledged without judgment. It was during one such visit, as they sat on his porch watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and purple, that Sarah first touched him with deliberate intent. They had been discussing a passage from David Copperfield, the latest book she had brought him, when she suddenly fell silent. Blackwood turned to find her studying him, her expression thoughtful. "May I?" she asked, reaching toward his face. He froze, uncertain of her intention, but unable to deny her anything. Her fingertips brushed lightly against the scar that ran from his eye to his mouth, tracing its jagged path with a gentleness that made his breath catch. "How did you get this?" she asked softly. No one had touched Blackwood with tenderness in more years than he could remember, and the simple contact of her fingers against his skin threatened to unravel him completely. "Saber," he managed to say, his voice hoarse with emotion. "Confederate cavalry officer at Gettysburg. I was 19. Sarah's hand lingered on his cheek, her eyes never leaving his. "You've been fighting for a very long time, haven't you, Jacob?" she murmured, and the use of his first name, so unexpected and intimate, broke something open inside him. Without conscious thought, he covered her hand with his own, pressing it more firmly against his face, anchoring himself to the warmth of her touch. "Yes," he whispered, "so long I don't know how to stop." In that moment, with the dying light gilding her face and her hand against his scarred cheek, Jacob Blackwood felt the first real hope that perhaps he could indeed stop fighting, could find peace, could become something more than the sum of his violent past. The fragile peace of that moment was shattered 3 days later when Blackwood returned from exercising his horses to find his cabin had been ransacked. Books lay torn and scattered across the floor. Furniture was overturned, and painted on the wall in what appeared to be chicken blood were the words, "Killers not welcome." His first thought was of Sarah. Would whoever had done this target her next for her association with him? Fury and fear battled within him as he quickly checked that his lockbox was still hidden and secure. It was, the Colt revolver inside untouched. Relief washed through him at that small mercy. He had not been forced to take up the gun again. Not yet. He set about cleaning the mess, his mind racing with possibilities. This had Stanton's fingerprints all over it, but Blackwood doubted the wealthy rancher had dirtied his own hands. Sheriff Garrett arrived the following morning, his expression grim as he surveyed the damage. "Stanton's men?" Blackwood asked, though it wasn't really a question. Garrett sighed, removing his hat and running a hand through his thinning hair. "Can't prove it," he said, "but 3 of his hands were drinking heavily at the saloon last night, boasting about sending messages before they rode out of town." He fixed Blackwood with a penetrating stare. "I need to know how you plan to handle this, Blackwood. If you're thinking about strapping on that gun again and seeking retribution, I need to know now." The accusation stung, though Blackwood understood it was Garrett's job to prevent bloodshed before it occurred. "I told you," he said steadily. "I'm done with killing. I'll repair the damage and go on as before." Garrett seemed both relieved and skeptical. "Stanton won't stop here," he warned. "He's convinced himself you're a threat to his control of the valley. Men like him, they can't abide what they can't intimidate or buy off." Blackwood knew the sheriff was right. This was merely the opening salvo in what would likely become an escalating campaign to drive him away. "I won't be run off my land," he stated flatly. "But I won't kill for it either. There has to be another way." Garrett nodded slowly, as if coming to a decision. "There might be," he said. "Town council meeting next week. Stanton plans to formally request your removal from the community as a public menace." If enough people speak in your defense. He left the sentence unfinished, the implication clear. Blackwood would need allies, people willing to stand against Stanton's influence. And in a town where most still cross the street to avoid him, Where would he find such support? When Sarah arrived later that day and saw the state of the cabin, her reaction was not the fear or withdrawal Blackwood had half expected, but righteous anger. "This is unconscionable," she declared, her cheeks flushed with indignation as she helped him restore order to the small space. "William Stanton is nothing but a bully, using his money and influence to control everyone and everything in this valley." Blackwood watched her gather the torn pages of David Copperfield with careful hands, her movements quick and precise. "Garrett says there's a council meeting next week," he said. "Stanton wants me declared a public menace and forced to leave." Sarah's head snapped up, her eyes flashing. "He can't do that. This is your home now. You have as much right to be here as anyone." Her fierce defense warmed something in Blackwood's chest, but he remained practical. The council listens to Stanton. His cattle business brings money to the town. I'm just one man with a small horse ranch and a bad reputation. Sarah set the salvaged book pages aside and moved to stand directly in front of him, her expression determined. "You're not alone, Jacob," she said, reaching out to take his large hands in her smaller ones. The contact sent a jolt through him, as it always did. "I'll speak for you at the council meeting. And I'll talk to others. Dr. Wilson, Reverend Thomas, the families of my students. There are good people in Redemption Creek who believe in second chances. We just need to help them find their courage to stand against Stanton's intimidation." The week before the council meeting saw a flurry of activity in Redemption Creek. Sarah, true to her word, moved through the community with purpose, speaking to anyone who would listen about Jacob Blackwood, not the notorious gunman of legend, but the man she had come to know, who read Homer and Dickens, who gentled horses with patience and care, who had chosen to lay down his gun and seek peace. Some dismissed her immediately, but others listened, particularly those who had witnessed her continued association with Blackwood without harm coming to her. If the schoolteacher, with her education and refined manners, could see something worthwhile in the man, perhaps there was more to him than the stories suggested. Meanwhile, Blackwood continued his solitary routine, working with his horses, repairing the damage to his cabin, and trying not to think about how much was at stake. Not just his property, but the fragile new life he was building, and the even more fragile hope that had begun to grow within him. The day of the town council meeting dawned clear and cool, with a hint of autumn in the air, though it was only late August. Blackwood dressed with care, in his best shirt and the dark suit coat he hadn't worn since leaving Cheyenne, feeling like a man preparing for his own trial. In many ways, he supposed he was. The town hall was packed when he arrived, with what seemed like every resident of Redemption Creek crowded into the small building. A hush fell over the crowd as he entered, and he felt the familiar weight of stares as he made his way to a seat in the back row. Sarah was already there, dressed in a becoming blue dress, her hair arranged more elegantly than usual. She smiled encouragingly at him, though he could see the tension in the set of her shoulders. William Stanton sat at the front of the room with the 4 other members of the town council, his expensive suit and gold watch chain marking him as a man of prosperity and influence. His expression when he caught sight of Blackwood was one of undisguised contempt, quickly masked with a politician's smile as Mayor Hendricks called the meeting to order. The proceedings began with routine matters: approval of funds for road repairs, discussion of the upcoming Harvest Festival, reports from various committee heads. Finally, Mayor Hendricks announced the last item on the agenda: consideration of concerns regarding the residency of Mr. Jacob Blackwood. as raised by Mr. William Stanton. A murmur ran through the crowd, and Blackwood sat very still, his face impassive despite the rapid beating of his heart. Stanton rose to his feet, adjusting his waistcoat, as he addressed the council and the assembled townspeople. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice carrying easily through the hall, "I come before you today out of concern for the safety and prosperity of our community. 3 months ago, a man with a reputation for violence and lawlessness purchased property in our peaceful valley. Since then, decent folk have lived in fear, worried for their safety and the safety of their children." He paused dramatically, his gaze sweeping the room. "Jacob Blackwood is known throughout the territories as a killer for hire, a man who has taken more lives than anyone in this room can count. His very presence threatens everything we have built here in Redemption Creek." Sarah's hand found Blackwood's in the dimness of the back row, her fingers twining with his in a gesture of solidarity that gave him strength. Stanton continued, his rhetoric growing more inflammatory as he detailed lurid stories of Blackwood's supposed atrocities, many of them exaggerated or entirely fabricated. When he finally concluded his speech, the mood in the hall was tense, with many people casting fearful glances toward the back where Blackwood sat. Mayor Hendricks cleared his throat nervously. "Does anyone wish to speak in response to Mr. Stanton's concerns?" For a terrible moment, there was silence. And Blackwood felt a sinking sensation in his chest. Then Sarah stood, her head held high. "I would like to speak," she said clearly, releasing Blackwood's hand and moving toward the front of the hall. Every eye followed her progress, expressions ranging from curiosity to disapproval. "Miss Prescott," Mayor Hendricks acknowledged, somewhat uneasily. Sarah turned to face the crowd, her gaze steady and unafraid. "I have known Jacob Blackwood for nearly 2 months now," she began. "I have visited his home, shared conversations with him, seen how he cares for his horses and his land. The man I know bears little resemblance to the monster Mr. Stanton has described." She spoke of Blackwood's intelligence, his gentle handling of animals, his efforts to build a peaceful life away from violence. "We are quick to condemn based on rumors and reputation," she continued, "but slow to recognize genuine efforts at redemption. Is this not a Christian community? Do we not believe in forgiveness and second chances?" Her words appeared to move some in the audience, but Stanton was quick to interject. "With all due respect to Miss Prescott, her association with Blackwood has clearly clouded her judgment. A school teacher, no matter how educated, cannot be expected to recognize the danger posed by a man of Blackwood's caliber." The condescension in his tone was unmistakable, and several people frowned at his dismissal of Sarah's testimony. Before she could respond, another voice spoke up from the middle of the crowd. "I'd like to speak as well." It was Dr. Wilson, rising slowly to his feet, his aged frame still commanding respect. "I've visited Blackwood's ranch twice now, to look at his horses and to treat a cut on his hand. In my professional opinion, he presents no danger to this community. In fact, his breeding program could bring valuable business to Redemption Creek." One by one, others rose to speak. Reverend Thomas, who reminded the assembly of the Christian duty of charity and the sin of false judgment. Tom Jenkins from the livery, who spoke of Blackwood's fair dealings and expertise with horses. Even Herbert Simmons, the nervous hotel owner, who admitted that Blackwood had been a model guest during his stay, quiet and respectful. Most surprising of all was the testimony of Johnny Miller, the third-grade student Sarah had mentioned, who stood on a chair to be seen and declared with childish conviction that Mr. Blackwood couldn't be a monster because Miss Prescott likes him, and she's the smartest person in town. The boy's innocent logic drew laughter from the crowd, easing some of the tension in the room. Throughout these testimonials, Blackwood remained seated, overwhelmed by the unexpected support. These people barely knew him, yet they were willing to stand against Stanton's influence to defend his right to remain in their community. It was more than he had dared to hope for, and it humbled him in a way no force or threat ever could. When Mayor Hendricks finally asked if Blackwood himself wished to address the council, he rose slowly, acutely aware of all eyes upon him. He was not a man accustomed to public speaking, but as he made his way to the front of the hall, he knew what needed to be said. He stood before them, his imposing height and broad shoulders making him seem larger than life, yet there was no menace in his bearing, only a quiet dignity. "I won't deny that I've done terrible things," he began, his deep voice carrying easily despite its softness. "I've killed men in war and after. I've earned the reputation that follows me, and I don't expect forgiveness for my past." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "But I came to Redemption Creek seeking peace, not trouble. I laid down my gun and purchased land to raise horses, hoping to live out my days doing honest work. I don't ask you to forget who I was. I only ask for the chance to show you who I'm trying to become." His gaze found Sarah in the crowd, and something in his expression must have revealed the depth of his feelings for her, because a collective murmur went through the assembly. "This community has shown me kindness I didn't expect and certainly didn't deserve. Whatever you decide today, I'm grateful for that." Mayor Hendricks called for a vote among the council members, and to Stanton's visible outrage, the decision was 3-2 in favor of allowing Blackwood to remain, provided he maintained his peaceful conduct. The rancher stormed out of the hall, promising that the matter wasn't settled. But for the moment, at least, Blackwood had won the right to stay. As the meeting adjourned and people began to file out, many paused to nod to him or even shake his hand, a level of acceptance he had never anticipated. Sarah waited for him by the door, her face radiant with triumph, and something deeper, something that made his heart race. "Walk me home?" she asked simply, and he nodded, too full of emotion to speak. They walked in companionable silence through the streets of Redemption Creek, the setting sun casting long shadows before them. When they reached the small house where Sarah boarded with the widow Carson, she turned to face him, her expression serious despite the joy of their victory. "I meant every word I said in there, Jacob," she told him, her voice soft in the gathering dusk. "I see who you are, not just who you were, and I see who you're becoming." She reached up then, her hand gentle against his scarred cheek, just as it had been that evening on his porch. "The world may have called you a monster, but I never will." And then she rose on her tiptoes and pressed her lips to his, in a kiss that held the promise of redemption, of a future neither of them had dared to imagine. In the months that followed, Jacob Blackwood's life transformed in ways he could never have anticipated. The hostility from Stanton and his supporters continued, but it was balanced by a growing acceptance from many in the community. His horse breeding business began to take root, with several local ranchers expressing interest in his stock. He found himself invited to community gatherings, no longer the fearsome outsider, but increasingly a respected, if somewhat reserved, member of Redemption Creek society. And at the center of it all was Sarah, whose belief in him had never wavered, whose hand in his had changed everything. The man they had called a monster discovered that with love and purpose, even the most damaged soul could find its way back to humanity. If you like this story, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your impressions of this story in the comments. To listen to the next story, click on the box on the left.